Okay, so in this lecture we're going to talk about Boria Sax's essay Animals as Tradition, and I thought this would be a good introduction just to some of the history of animal stories and how sort of throughout time human society has used animals symbolically in our storytelling and in our culture. Um, and Boria Sax is kind of trying to emphasize the fact that animals, if we think of animals as tradition, we're more likely to know, respect, and preserve animals as well. So it's when we lose that connection with animals that they're disrespected, marginalized, and suffer in human society. So he's saying to view animals as a tradition and to preserve that long history of human-animal relationships encourages a kind of respect for animals, and that can counter, extinction. So that's basically his thesis. He does identify different types of animals as tradition, different categories. So he looks at all the sort of stories throughout history and looks at how animals have been sort of used or the function that they play as a kind of traditional knowledge in folklore or myth. And it's an interesting essay for sure, and it kind of I think sets up some of the discussion we'll have within our first unit. So animals as symbols. So at the very beginning of his essay, Sachs presents this idea of looking at animals and what do we see. So when you look at a squirrel, what do you see? Is it just something that's cute and fuzzy? Is it a nuisance? Is it scary? A wild creature? You don't know what it's going to be. So there's this level of projection that we project onto animals, um, our own feelings, our fears, um, qualities or traits that we associate with animals based on culture or stories that we've heard. And it's never neutral, right? You never have a kind of neutral animal. It's always a projection of some sort of human quality or human feeling placed onto them. So he gives the example of seeing a squirrel. So I'll just read from the first section of his essay. You are sitting in the park and your eyes meet those of a squirrel. What do you see? The Vikings saw a messenger that moved back and forth between the underworld and the abodes of human and gods. The Ainu saw the worn, discarded sandals of the god Aona. For late medieval people, the squirrel was sometimes a form taken by a witch. Simply by saying the name squirrel, however, we dissipate part of the mystery. So, depending on, your culture, where you're from, the mythology and narratives that are part of your culture, you would see different things within that animal. So the squirrel is what we make it to be, basically. So that's kind of the point of where he's trying to convey this idea that animals are symbolic and we're the ones that place this symbolic value onto them and view them as something that also has abstract ideas associated with it. Another example that he uses is totem animals. So he's saying part of the tradition of viewing animals comes from this idea of totem animals. So this is in his category metamorphosed animals. And he talks about tribal societies and how in certain societies animals were viewed as sort of a connection to the spiritual world. So this is on page 272. He says, in tribal societies, human form is not always important. All beings are forever changing their shapes like waves breaking on the shore. Human beings may become ravens, while hares may turn into human beings. And then it goes on. Totems are animals from which a tribe traces its ancestry. Beyond that, they are guardians of the tribe, at times revisiting the members in trances or in dreams. Among the Indo-Europeans, the tribal totem was perhaps most frequently the wolf. Going into battle, warriors would be possessed by the spirit of the wolf, and our legends of werewolves are a legacy of that archaic time. So there is this sort of connection he's seeing between human societies, in this case tribal societies, and animals as totem animals. So they were used to trace their ancestry, or there's a mythology around animals, and the belief that, in some cases, animals or gods take the form of animals. They're guardians, messengers, helpers, guides, and they're part of this different mythologies that exist for certain groups of people. He also notes the fact that some of these qualities of animal stories carry over. So even he says, stories of werewolves are a legacy of that ancient condition or ancient narrative of shapeshifters. So all of these sort of stories exist across the time and space, and represent a tradition of viewing animals as somehow sacred, or preserving a kind of human animal connection that is the basis of creation for certain people who believe that. Another example he gives is biblical Genesis. So in the biblical story of Adam and Eve, Adam was actually the one who named the animals. So even in this example, he is talking about how humans have this, they assert knowledge over animals and project onto them. So even in that biblical story, Adam was the one who named the animals. So the act of naming can be also seen as an act of power. It gives you dominance over them, or control. You control their name. Animal symbolism in that story is very potent too. You have the snake, which is kind of almost a universal or archetypal symbol of evil. And in Eden, in sort of a utopia where animals and humans live together in harmony. And I think Adam was able to talk with animals. So there was this idealized version of life where there was no death, and there was unity between humans and animals in the Christian biblical tradition as well. In Egyptian cultures, there was also a history of divine animals. And the one example they were using in the text on 273, he uses Egyptians as an example, but there's many other cultures throughout history that have viewed animals as divine or spiritual. And he refers to the Egyptians who worshiped their gods as incarnated in cats and other creatures. In some cases, the imagery of the divine, the gods and goddesses, often blend features of human and animals together. So you might have the human-like body, the animal head, and then eventually he says, with urbanization and industrial and capitalism, we've moved away from animal gods to human gods. So there was kind of a loss or shift or change within traditions, where we lost our animal gods and gained human anthropomorphic gods. There's other stories within the history, world history, where you have animals as not divine but as demonic, and this is another tradition. So certain animals, like we saw, the snake is kind of a demonic animal, a symbol of the devil or of evil. He uses Sachs uses the example of the witch trials in the Renaissance era, where people thought that cats or any woman with a cat was seen as a witch and would be persecuted and put on trial and tortured for being suspected to be a witch, and their cat companions were called familiars and were thought to be possessed by the devil. So that's another kind of tradition, cultural tradition, where animals were viewed as evil or another kind of symbolic item. Satiric animals, so this is another category that Sachs talks about. So he says in a lot of stories where animals are used as characters, they're often satirical stories or allegorical stories where animal characters stand in for humans. So rather than having human characters, they just draw animals in there. But the behaviors are all human behaviors. So these are animals that talk, have ethical dilemmas like humans, have capacity for reason like humans, but they're just animal forms. So it's can be a form of satire, and for example, Aesop's fables, and we'll look at a couple. They were used to criticize the ruling classes. So we usually think of them just as funny or silly children's tales. Maybe there's a lesson or moral attached to them, but there's this other level of satire where Aesop was able to communicate a kind of valuable message to his Greek society about, um, you know, he was trying to criticize the ruling classes and protest a bit against the authority figures of Greek society. So he used storytelling and animals in this way. Animals are often used metaphorically, so our language, we have certain sayings, and we tend to sort of convey um, almost prototypical traits in animals. So we see animals as representing certain qualities or possessing certain things, and we'll use that in our language. So we have a lot of metaphors, animal metaphors. Sly like a fox, proud like a lion, loyal like a dog, greedy as a pig, busy as a bee. So we use these kind of metaphors to, they use animals, but they're, again, often used to describe human behaviors. And Aesop, which we were talking about, the fables, he will draw upon some of these metaphorical or prototypical traits in conveying ideas about human behavior. So we have Sachs going through the traditions, how traditional stories would use animals, but then he marks a kind of shift. So he talks about the modern period and after. So with, um, you know, technology uh, and industry and technological progress, we've sort of moved away further and further away from our dependency on animals. We would have lived more closely with animals when we were, you know, living on an agricultural based society where we depended on animals as, you know, for on our farms or for our food. And we would have been, you know, have animals as part of our property. So we moved away from that when we became urbanized and moved to big cities. And this kind of distance has been created, a detachment from animals, and we can see that in the modern era. So there are some important things that uh, happened in society where we're reminded of our closeness with animals, and one of them was Darwin's theory of evolution. So Sachs will talk about this as kind of a um, benchmark in our discussion of human-animal connections. So he talks about, this is page 276, in the 18th century, Linnaeus classed human beings as primates, placing them in the same genus as monkeys, apes, and lemurs. Then in 1859, Charles Darwin proclaimed his theory of evolution in The Origin of Species, suggesting at first, he did not say it outright, that humanity evolved from something like an ape. There were passionate debates and embarrassed snickers. People joked about having gorillas for grandfathers. But there was this underlying fear that there is somehow still too much animal behavior in humans, or we're not as far removed from our ancestors as apes than we believe ourselves to be. Um, so there's always this fear or this idea that there's an animal within each of us that's going to sort of surface, or that we are not evolved, we haven't evolved enough to solve some of our animal-like behaviors. So there's this idea, this connection between humans and animals is, in a sense, biological um, and evolutionary, but it's also symbolic in the sense that we use animals to think about ideas and to tell our stories. Sachs will also talk about the sort of many different versions of anthropomorphic animals that we have in modern culture. So yeah, he makes the point of saying, yeah, today anthropomorphic animals are everywhere we look. Tigers sell cornflakes and gasoline. Talking cows sell milk. Bulls and ducks represent sport teams. Centerfolds of undressed women in Playboy are called bunnies, while in Penthouse, a rival magazine, they are called pets. The cartoon character Joe Camel was effective in selling cigarettes to teenagers. So all these different ideas are examples of anthropomorphic animals. So these are animals that are given human-like traits and emotions. So in a way, they are the creation or construction of animals as humans. And this is one way that we have animals in our modern society, is to anthropomorphize them and use them to sell products or to entertain us. And the sort of ethical questions that Sachs brings up relate to this division that he sees, that in modern society we've grown further and further away from our connections with animals, and this has had a sort of destruction or destructive impact on animals. So the further and further we sort of move away from our dependency on animals and our respect of them and knowledge of them, the more they're going to suffer. So he talks about, today there are countless species that are driven to extinction. So today countless species are driven to extinction, and people who are becoming increasingly urban have ever less contact with animals on a daily basis. This has resulted in two seemingly contradictory trends. On the one hand, there is ruthless exploitation of animals in factory farms and in industry. At the same time, our current estrangement from animals seems to have revived some of the numinous qualities that they had in the archaic past. So on the negative side, it's, our distance from animals means that, um, certain there's, questions of exploitation of animals, using them as objects, genetic testing, cloning, factory farms. All these um, are subsequent to the fact that we are no longer connected or respectful of animals the way that we once were. So that's one side of it. But he also argues that on the other level, that we're sort of moving back towards this feeling that animals are somewhat, we're connected to them on an ecological level. So our their connection to the world is what we have to do, is sort of protect animals and protect the world, and all things are sort of connected in that way. So he says that's also part of the sort of modern turn to looking at animals as a kind of mouth of the natural world, and a sign of the health and well-being of the earth as a whole. So he talks about animals as almost like a symbol or object of nature that we learn and read nature from. And so basically, Sachs emphasizes this idea that for humans, animals have a symbolic connection, that we use and see and view animals symbolically. And he quotes from the anthropologist Claude Levi-Strauss, who said that animals are good to think with. So that's one of the things that we can think about through this class, is how animals are used in narrative or poems or whatever, to convey ideas. So how do authors and artists use animals to create and convey certain ideas? And I'm particularly fascinated by this question of, our connection to animals on a sort of biological level. We tend to think of ourselves as superior or above animals, and, view ourselves as, having evolved from animals, but, that we're stronger, more evolved, more reason filled. We've evolved past animals and some are superior to them, but like, is that true? Or what part of us is still connected to those animal biological connections? So that's kind of what I'm fascinated by as well. And so I've picked some texts that sort of show us or blur the lines between the human and animal divide, and kind of reveal the fact that, what Sachs says, no animal completely lacks humanity and no person is completely human. So I think there's that kind of blurring of lines that goes on in a lot of the texts that we're going to read this semester.